Putin's shadow apparatus was supposed to be his key to winning the Ukraine war. The inner circle trusted by Putin was everything, but that inner circle has backstabbed him by doing something so insane that it has sabotaged the entire Ukraine war. And worst of all for Putin, it was his own secret service that slid the knife right into his back. How? Well, the FSB stole $5 billion right from under Putin's nose. And that's according to Christopher Steele, who is the former leader of the Russia desk at the UK's MI6 intelligence organisation. Now, speaking to the Trump Report at the end of December, Steele laid it all out. I think it's clear that a very large sum of money was allocated by the Kremlin, by Putin, to sort of subversive operations in Ukraine, probably up to $5 billion between 2014 and 2022, and a lot of that money simply disappeared into the pockets of SFB officers and FSB businesses, and was utterly corruptly embezzled from the effort, Steele claims. This was money that Putin had earmarked for use in Ukraine. Russia's leader wanted to weaken his target before he struck, and he's made sure that his secret service, the FSB, which is supposed to be one of his most powerful instruments, had everything that it needed to get the job done. But instead of reporting on the reality of what Ukraine was doing to prepare for a fight, or conducting the sorts of operations that would damage Ukraine, the money was pocketed. And all Putin received before he launched his invasion was nonsense about how Ukraine wasn't ready, and how it wouldn't be able to put up a fight because the country was too weak. We'll come back to that point a little later in this video. First, the big question is simple. Is there any evidence behind Steele's claims? Now, while Steele doesn't provide any evidence himself, paying even a little bit of attention to what was happening to several people in the FSB during the 2014 to 2022 period shows us that corruption was rife in the organization. And we have 3 cases for you, each of which involves the kind of squirreling away of Kremlin resources into FSB pockets that shows exactly what we mean when we say that Putin has been stabbed in the back. Now first, we take you to July 2017 and the eruption of a massive scandal in the FSB. Now in that month, the Warsaw Institute reported that information on the detention of several FSB officers who were suspected of corruption had been leaked to the media, suggesting that Putin's security apparatus was already collapsing into infighting and jealousy long before he invaded Ukraine. The story revolves around a man named Sergei Chemysov, who was then, and still is, the head of the state corporation Rostec. Now, Chemysov is one of the FSB's most influential figures, and his position on the Rostec board means that he also controls a company called Snegiryov Research Institute of Technology. Now, that company happens to make electromechanical and mechanical detonators for different types of ammunition, which means that it is a pretty important part of the war machine that Putin would later unleash on Ukraine. Now, a group of FSB officials who were supposed to be working for Putin and should have been aligned with the Rostec head were the first to betray Russia's leader. That group, the Warsaw Institute says, tried to extort large bribes from the board of the Snegiryov Research Institute of Technology. But that is just the start of the problem. Those FSB officials had been investigating the institute and had discovered that salaries were being paid to vacant posts within the business. These dead souls were getting paid, and the officials wanted bribes of a few million rubles for each of the vacant positions they found. Chemysov flexed his FSB influence and had 5 corrupt FSB officers arrested. But he only did it because those officers were trying to con a conman, and the money being paid to the vacant posts had to be going somewhere, and the odds are that somewhere is Chemysov's own pocket. Now, Chemysov has survived. He still leads Rostec, but immediately we see the scale of the problem that Steele mentioned. FSB officials were willing to hide Chemysov's misdeeds in return for bribes, and Chemysov himself is filtering money through an institute that is essential to the Russian war effort right into his own pocket. Now, this is a form of sabotage that is being hidden from Putin, and it gets much worse. Fast forward to May 2019, and the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project was reporting on a former FSB official called Colonel Kirill Charkalin. He was in hot water with the Russian government after being detained for using his former position as the head of the FSB's Financial Counterintelligence Unit to accept bribes worth up to $850,000. As part of the investigation, Russia sent officials to scour Cherkalin's apartment. There, they found that $850,000 was, well, something of an underestimate. Those officials eventually left the former FSB's official's home carrying several massive bags containing 12 billion rubles, which was equivalent to about $185 million at the time. Now, the irony in all of this is that Cherkalin had previously led an FSB department that was responsible for uncovering the very sort of corruption that he engaged in. Under Cherkilin's watch, investigations have been carried out into the billionaire brothers Magomed and Ziauddin Magomedov. Cherkilin's FSB department had also looked into the former Russian economy minister, Alexei Ulyukayev, as well as another former minister named Mikhail Abazov. Just like with the Chemezov case, we see corruption layered on corruption. Now, political infighting is more important within Putin's inner circle than actually delivering what Russia's president wants and needs. And through all of that infighting, billions of dollars are simply disappearing. Chemezov used his power to avoid his fate. Cherkilin wasn't so lucky. In April 2021, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his crimes, along with a pair of other FSB officers named Andrei Vasiliev and Dmitry Frolov. So Cherkilin wasn't even acting alone. He had 2 other FSB agents come along for the ride. And we have one more example to share with you before we come back to what the many examples of corruption that are just like this have meant for Putin. So in February 2024, the Bell reported that Russian investigators were looking into an incident that had seen FSB officials team up with crooked members of Russia's investigative committee to fabricate a murder case that they then used to extort 15 billion rubles, or around $200 million, from the supposed suspects. The FSB accused the co-owners of one of Russia's leading household appliances companies, Merlion, of hiring a veteran of Putin's earlier war in the Donbass to kill their former CEO, Vyacheslav Simonenko. The 3 men, Oleg Karchov, Vladislav Mangutov, and Alexei Abramov, were claimed to have offered the unnamed hitman a $5 million bonus if he managed to kill Simonenko by launching Molotov cocktails at his house. Now, this already seems like an unlikely story, but it was enough to see the accused trio spend 6 months in jail as they awaited a trial that could have landed each in prison for up to 20 years if they were convicted. That was the whole point for the FSB officials. As the 3 men awaited their trial, a corrupt lawyer working for the FSB offered them a way out. All they would have to pay was the aforementioned $200 million, in addition to a cut of 2% of Merlion's turnover every single year. And what the FSB officials didn't expect was that the businessman would refuse, with the fallout of the whole affair revealing that an entire gang of 24 high-ranking law enforcement officials had conspired to get paid rather than do their jobs as Putin ordered them to. And that's the point. Not all of these 3 cases are examples of FSB officers stealing money that was directly intended for destabilizing Ukraine. But what each case shows us is that the FSB is rotten to the core and has been since long before Putin invaded. FSB officials seem far more concerned with lining their own pockets than they are with supporting Putin's war effort. And that, in its own way, is a form of decade-plus-long sabotage that has rocked Putin's war machine from the moment he sent his troops into Ukraine. Now let's talk about that moment for a few minutes. Earlier, we told you that the rampant corruption in the FSB meant that Putin went into the Ukraine war with a head that was filled with nonsense. That happened because Russia's leader trusted the FSB. Now, this organization, which was clearly supposed to be infallible, was falling apart right before his eyes, and he couldn't even see it. And make no mistake about the FSB's importance to the Ukraine invasion. As Steele points out, it was the agency out of all that Russia has that was supposed to have the lead in the build-ups to the Ukraine invasion. Certainly, before the war sort of full-on came in 2022, the FSB was the lead agency in Ukraine covering Ukraine, Steele says. And rather than doing what Putin wanted, the agency told their leader what he wanted to hear. The $5 billion in lost money came with the added bogus bonus of the FSB telling Putin, yeah, it was fine to invade Ukraine. It'll be a walkover. You'll be welcomed as victors and liberators and so on, Steele says the FSB told Putin. So as the money was being stolen, this was the same organization that was telling the Russian leader that there was an entire alternative political structure in Ukraine that was waiting to take over and would happily do so under the Russian thumb. It was all lies. FSB sabotage to keep the gravity train rolling while officials did everything in their power to avoid having to deliver anything that even resembled the bad news that Ukraine was more ready than anybody ever expected before February 2022. Putin certainly trusted the FSB enough to keep pouring the money in. In August 2022, Business Insider reported that the FSB's Ukraine unit had been expanding in size since 2019 to the point where it contained 160 officers when it had once had 30. That alone tells us that Putin had been plotting the Ukraine invasion for years before he pulled the trigger, and it was the FSB that was supposed to let him know what he needed to do to make the so-called special military operation a success. But while the Kremlin built, the shadow apparatus sabotaged. And frankly, that shouldn't have come as a surprise to anybody. Lying is in the FSB's nature. The agency has long been accused of conducting hoaxes and making false accusations, though this was all supposed to be in the service of Putin's ultimate goals. And as the New York Times says, the FSB is more a political tool for Putin than it is any sort of serious law enforcement agency. The entire organization was born from the ashes of the KGB that gave the world Putin, and it has the same habits of blaming others for the crimes that it commits. We saw plenty of that in the 3 cases we discussed earlier, when it was so often FSB agents using supposed crimes to leech money out of the Russian system. Putin himself got in on the act plenty when he was Russia's prime minister back in 1999. He blamed Chechen militants for a series of apartment bombings in Moscow. Those allegations blew up in Putin's face when citizens from the nearby city of Ryazan found bags of what looked like explosives inside their building. The FSB was forced to apologize, though it still claimed that the bags contained nothing but sugar and were used for an anti-terror drill. In the end, Putin got what he wanted, which was opening the door for a new Russian attack on Chechnya. But unknown to him at the time, Putin had made a rod for his own back. The FSB that he built on lies and bribery is just doing what he built it to do. With that context, the knife in Putin's back is one that he should have seen coming. Of course the FSB would lie to Putin. They'd seen him do the same to get what he wanted in Chechnya, so FSB officials lied when it became clear that Putin really wanted to invade Ukraine. And as they lied to him about what invading Ukraine would really require, the officials made sure their pockets were being lined so they would be financially secure against the absolute storm that they knew was coming. Now, some of those FSB officials have been caught in their corruption, but the real question is how many haven't been caught. We may never know the answer to that question, but we do know what the FSB's corruption has done to Putin. Back in 2014, Putin claimed that Russia's forces could take Kyiv in 2 weeks if they wanted to. Russia's president would have believed that, just like he thought it would only take a couple of weeks, if not just a handful of days, to take Kyiv in 2022. It's 4 years later, and Russia is still nowhere near defeating Ukraine. Putin has sold a bill of goods, and he bought it happily because it contained all that he wanted to hear. Of course, we can't always attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence. As the Washington Post says, it wasn't just the corrupt inside the FSB sliding the knife in and purposefully misleading their president. In the days leading up to the Ukraine invasion, the FSB had sent messages to its informants in Kyiv that it was time to leave their homes. Russia was coming, and Kyiv would be a war zone in a matter of days. One intercepted message even showed an FSB official telling one of those informants to have a successful trip. That's how confident the FSB was. It may also explain why so many of its members thought that they could steal from under Putin's nose. Rather than actually doing their jobs, these officials appear to have simply assumed that Ukraine was there for the taking. Russia would win easily, and that would mean that their corruption wouldn't matter. Putin would get what he wanted. However, as an unnamed US official who spoke to the Washington Post put it, the Russians were wrong by a mile about the strength of Ukraine's defense. That official added they set up an entire war effort to seize strategic objectives that were beyond their means. Russia's mistake was really fundamental and strategic, fundamental being the key word here. Russia didn't even get the basics right, and it's all because the FSB was plagued with wishful thinking. As the organization received polls telling it that many of Ukraine's citizens were willing to fight against Russia, the FSB delivered rosy messages about the ease of the upcoming invasion to Putin. It was the FSB that championed the lightning assault plan that we saw fall apart during the first few weeks of the war. Ultimately, the FSB stabbed Putin in the back by sabotaging his war plans before they were even put into action. The plans themselves were faulty, and Putin had no idea until tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were dying, and he was left wondering why the Kremlin's cash hadn't been enough to warn him of what was coming. But Putin knows better now, right? The corruption has been stamped out, even if it came too late to stop him from making crucial mistakes in Ukraine, surely. Well, the answer is no on both accounts. Corruption, fraud, embezzlement, or whatever you want to call it, is so baked into the Russian hierarchy that it has simply become the way that things are done. In January 2024, a trio of FSB officers were arrested on charges related to accepting 5 billion rubles, or about $55 million, in bribes. Alexander Ushakov was charged with creating a criminal group using his official powers, while 2 accomplices, Sergei Manishkin and Alexei Tsaryov, ended up under house arrest for throwing their co-conspirator under the bus. Just 4 months after that, a former FSB officer was sentenced to 9 years in prison for accepting a $1.7 million bribe from a hacking group. Grigory Tsaregorodstev, who hilariously was supposed to be specializing in combating online crime, said he would protect the hacker group from the authorities in return for the money. Tsaregorodstev failed. The hackers ratted him out, and yet another FSB official was exposed for looking out for himself rather than doing what Putin was paying him to do. Even now, the Russian war machine is plagued by corruption on a scale that is causing Putin's Plan B for the Ukraine war to fail after the FSB so spectacularly screwed up Plan A. The Russian military-industrial complex, or OPK, is blighted by the same issues that run rampant in the FSB. As Chatham House put it in July 2025, endemic corruption is a defining feature of the OPK and, more widely, of the Russian military. Corruption facilitates the inner workings of the military establishment. Putin is basically playing corruption whack-a-mole at this point. For every successful strike the mallet makes, 2 more cases crop up. Putin can't rid Russia of corruption. He is corruption embodied, which is why his inner circle so readily betrays him. Those doing the investigating on Putin's behalf are often corrupt themselves, and they will be caught out by other corrupt people and so on, which has turned Putin's inner circle into an Ouroboros of degradation and failure. Nothing that Putin can do will make this better. This is what he built Russia and especially the FSB to be. I don't think you'd want to be anywhere near Putin when you brought bad news, Steele says during his appearance on the Trump Report. And of course, what that means is the distortion of information going up to leadership is quite significant and will have an impact. I would argue on both the politics and foreign policy of Russia, but also warfighting and the economy. Putin lives in a bubble. He doesn't want the bad news. He doesn't want to have to actually pay attention to what is happening in the corrupt systems he built, as long as those systems are doing their jobs. But while the cat's away, the mice will play. And those mice have burrowed so many holes into Russia's house that the collapse of Putin's Ukraine war is inevitable. As his inner circle sabotages his every move, Putin also has to deal with everyday people inside the occupied territories of Ukraine who are resisting Russia's every move. These are the people that the FSB told Putin would welcome Russia with open arms. But they're using violent and non-violent means to resist, as you'll discover if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more investigations into the failure of the system that Putin has built around himself.